Joan of Arc, the savior of France, a central figure in the 100 Years' War and a symbol of national resistance. How did a young peasant girl accused of religious dissent become a saint? Why does her story continue to captivate historians, artists, and politicians? What allowed Joan to enter the ranks of the most famous figures in world history? This is a story filled with myths and contradictions. We will attempt to separate truth from fiction and understand how Joan of Arc changed the course of the war and the fate of France. Joan was born against the backdrop of the longest conflict in history, the 100 Years' War. This large-scale conflict between England and France, which lasted intermittently from 1337 to 1453, was triggered by a dispute over the right to inherit the French throne. The cause was the death of King Charles IV, who left no heirs. His nephew, King Edward III of England, claimed rights to the throne. But Philip VI of the Valois dynasty ascended instead. What was the real cause of the conflict? The 100 Years' War went beyond a dynastic dispute. It was a question of the survival of an entire nation, France, which was on the verge of disappearing. Gradually, the war turned into a struggle for territory, control over French lands, and trade routes. The English army, thanks to military tactics and discipline, achieved significant success. By the beginning of the 15th century, most of France was in English hands. Joan of Arc was born in 1412 in the village of Domremy to a prosperous peasant family led by Jacques d'Arc. Despite her peasant origins, Joan grew up in relative comfort. Her family owned 20 acres of land, a fairly substantial estate for peasants of that era. Perhaps this is why Joan, later in court, surprised those around her with her manners. Rumors that she might have been the illegitimate daughter of the Duke of Orléans turned out to be myths, likely arising from her confident demeanor and innate sense of dignity. Joan stood out from an early age for her religious devotion and virtuous behavior. In one document reviewing her case after her passing, Joan's godparents mentioned that she was a quiet and obedient child, but would visit closed church spaces without permission, reflecting her curiosity and independence. When Joan turned 13, she began hearing voices. In her visions, she saw saints, the Archangel Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, who told her that she had a great mission to save France from the English invaders and help Dauphin Charles become king. These visions became a turning point in Joan's life, as they entirely shaped her actions from then on. Religious revelations were not uncommon at that time, especially in deeply pious medieval Europe. Nevertheless, the fact that they had such an impact on a teenage girl from a simple peasant family marked the beginning of a legend. It was likely due to her profound faith and conviction in her divine mission that Joan managed to convince many people, including influential men of the time, that she was worth listening to. In 1428, at age 16, Joan traveled to Vaucouleurs, where she met with Captain Robert de Baudricourt, the commander of the local garrison. She told him God sent her to save France and see Charles VII on the throne. Baudricourt, of course, did not take her seriously and openly laughed at the girl who came with such ambitious statements. At that time, France was in a desperate situation. English troops controlled Paris and most of the country, and it seemed France's fate was sealed. Yet Joan was persistent. She predicted a French defeat in an upcoming battle, and when her prophecy came true, the captain began to take her seriously. Realizing that this young woman might be destined to play an important role in history, he agreed to send her to the Dauphin Charles. Joan arrived at the court of Charles VII in March 1429. To convince him of her mission, she needed to do more than simply recount her visions. One legend suggests that she immediately recognized Charles in a crowd, even though he deliberately hid among his courtiers to test her. This incident, if true, made a strong impression on the king and his advisors. It's important to note that Charles was in a difficult political situation. His right to the throne was contested, and control over France was slipping from his hands. The French army was demoralized, resources were running out, and public support was waning. Joan brought something Charles desperately needed: belief in victory. For a medieval king, divine support was crucial, and Charles was willing to use any opportunity to strengthen his position. The turning point in Joan's life was the Siege of Orléans. By 1429, this city was a key point of France's defense, and its fall could have meant France's final defeat. The English besieged Orléans and its fate seemed predetermined. Joan was granted permission to accompany the army to Orléans, though initially she was not given command. However, her presence had a huge impact on the soldiers. She inspired them, instilling hope and confidence that victory was possible. To the surprise of many, the siege of Orléans was lifted just 9 days after Joan's arrival. It was a miracle that neither the French nor the English expected. Although Joan was not a military leader in the full sense of the word, her contribution to the victory was invaluable. She did not directly participate in combat, but carried the flag and continuously boosted the army's morale. In her confession later, she mentioned that she never took a life, but her influence on the fighters was so great that she came to be seen as a symbol of divine support for France. After this victory, Joan received the title of the Maid of Orléans, and her status in France became almost legendary. She instilled in the people and the army a belief that God was on the side of the French and that victory over the English was possible. After liberating Orléans, Joan persuaded Charles of the need for a coronation in Reims, the traditional site for the coronation of French kings. At that time, the city was on territory controlled by the English and their allies, the Burgundians. Nevertheless, despite all the difficulties, Joan once again managed to mobilize the army and set out on a campaign to Reims. In July 1429, Charles was crowned at Reims Cathedral, an important political and symbolic act. France had regained a king, largely thanks to Joan, who accompanied Charles and insisted on this step. The coronation strengthened the legitimacy of Charles VII and became a turning point in the 100 Years' War, though difficult battles still lay ahead. However, after the coronation of Charles VII, Joan's fate began to change. Despite her successes, the political situation remained complex. Joan continued to insist on a military campaign to free Paris, which was still under English control. But her efforts here were less successful. An attempt to capture Paris in 1429 failed, weakening her influence at court. In May 1430, Joan was captured by the Burgundians, French allies of the English. She was leading a small army attempting to lift the siege of the city of Compiègne, but was captured in battle. This marked the beginning of her tragic turn of events. After her capture, Joan was handed over to the English. For them, she represented a threat not only as a symbol of French resistance, but also as a challenge to their authority. If her influence continued to grow, the English decided to put her on trial for religious charges. The most serious accusation of the time meant to strip her of all support and authority. Joan's trial was biased and politically motivated. Despite her brave defense, the judges, under pressure from the English, still sentenced her. She was accused of refusing to give up her visions and of wearing men's clothing, a symbol of her military career. On May 30th, 1431, at the age of just 19, Joan of Arc met her end in Rouen. Her passing was a tragedy, but even after her sentence, her legend only began to grow. 25 years after her sentence, in 1456, a review of Joan's case was held at the request of Charles VII, who had by then solidified his power. This review cleared Joan of all charges, declaring her innocent. Her name was restored, and the original judgment was declared void. This step symbolized the triumph of justice and acknowledgement of her contributions to France. In 1920, Joan of Arc was canonized by the Catholic Church and proclaimed a saint. She became a national heroine of France and a symbol of patriotism and courage. The story of Joan of Arc continues to inspire and move people around the world. She became a symbol of the fight for justice, courage, and faith in one's ideals. Her life is an example of how one person can change the course of history and the fate of an entire nation. Joan of Arc is not just a warrior or a political figure. She became a legend whose story, full of mysticism, heroism, and sacrifice, will forever remain in humanity's memory.